Now we have Andrew Collins is going to be sharing his fascinating research into the Denisovans. Since the last conference in 2017, we had a year off last year, he's published the book Denisovan Origins with the brilliant Greg Little. And also since then, he's been banned from ever going to Gobekli Tepe. And it seems he's been banned from Turkey as well. It doesn't end there. We also found out that he was excommunicated from his local church. And he's been in all sorts of trouble in various other places.
And caused an international incident in Egypt, of course, with the discovery of the caves.
Yeah, the Comet caves, Zahi Hawass was delighted about. As you know, Andrew is a well-known author. He's published many books at the cutting edge of ancient mysteries, including books about Gobekli Tepe, Egypt, and many other subjects. But today he's going to get into the Denisovans, the update on the Denisovans, and all the other research that's been happening over the last year or two. There's some very interesting and extremely ancient discoveries that are going to be revealed today. So please give a warm welcome to Andrew Collins.
Okay. Right. We'll know that around 11,800 years ago, there was a comet impact, right? I don't think there's very few people, very few scientists, very few people working in the field of paleoclimatology and whatever that would now deny that. Archaeologists still do, of course, particularly those working at Gobekli Tepe. But I am certain that there is a relationship between the construction of the earliest monumental architecture in the world and this comet impact. And there is comet imagery actually on the stones at Gobekli Tepe which almost confirm this relationship. For instance, this is enclosure D, and on the right is pillar 18, probably one of the most impressive, I think, of all of them, certainly the largest. And we have this belt buckle, quite literally belt buckle, and this anthropomorphic character that's represented by this stone. And in my opinion, that is a comet, and I'll show you for why. Because that's the shape of what you get. This is ancient Chinese representations of comets here, which I've used in one of my books. Obviously, that's a comet there. And you can see the tails. These are the tails of it. Almost certainly it's representing a three-tailed comet. And it's even got what's known as the bow shock, which is the energetic solar particles. When they encounter the comet's coma, they create this effect. And although obviously it's difficult for us to see, we must accept almost certainly that the ancients had a better eyesight than us. Almost certainly they did. And there's even more evidence of a comet relationship on this stone, because directly beneath it is this fox pelt loincloth. And universally around the world, the fox's tail in particular has been seen as a representation of a comet tail. That's not just in the Americas, in China, for instance, in certain parts of Europe, but even, what did I say, Britain? Yeah, in Britain, for instance, in heraldry, a comet is actually represented by a fox's tail to this day. And the fact that these individuals are quite clearly being shown to be associated with this particular totem, I think is very important, because canines, particularly wolves, foxes, coyotes, have universally been seen as tricksters that are associated with the stability of the world. In other words, because they are tricksters, they could just push the post that holds the universe together and the whole thing could fall over and the end of the world would come and time would stop. So it was important, in my opinion, for the shamans of any community to go into the other world and to deal with these supernatural creatures that were seen as responsible for cataclysms like the comet impact, the Younger Dryas event. And so, in my opinion, Gobekli Tepe was constructed as a point of easy access into a sky world that was accessed not just through the huge central monoliths that were in obviously the middle of various of the enclosures, but the axis of those particular enclosures was somehow focused and oriented and targeted the actual entrance into the sky world. Well, where exactly would that have been? Well, this is the layout of enclosure D. You can see how beautiful this oval design is. It's an exact 3:4 ratio, by the way. And the pillars conform perfectly to the geometry involved in this. And the line of access through the central pillars hits this stone at the top, which you can see there, which has got a hole in it, and then off towards the local horizon. Well, this is what it looks like. And my colleague Rodney Hale, as early as 2006, in fact earlier, 2004, looked into the orientations that would have been connected with the alignment at not just enclosure D, but 3 other of the enclosures there, and all of them targeted the setting of the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus at the time of the construction of these monuments. In other words, from about 9,600 onwards. But the thing is that they're targeting not just Cygnus, the stars, but they're targeting the northern entrance to the so-called dark rift, which is there, right? Which is obviously where the stars of Cygnus is. And this again has been universally seen as a point of entry and exit into the sky world. For instance, the road of Zilbalba in Mayan mythology and cosmology, that is also coinciding with the dark rift of the Milky Way. But in the Near East, in Greece, and also, more importantly, in Armenia, and remember, the area of Gobekli Tepe used to be part of Armenia until fairly recent times. The Cygnus stars are a bird, but they're actually a vulture in the sky. And this is very, very important because all of this was realised, and all these alignments that myself and the engineer Rodney Hale worked on was before the discovery of this. I mean, when I first went to Gobekli Tepe in 2004, this stone, which we know affectionately as the Vulture Stone, because obviously it's prominence of the vulture on it, but it's technically known as Pillar 43, which is located just to the west of the actual Hold sighting stone, which I showed you on the previous one. That was barely uncovered. And right from 2010 and possibly even earlier, it was realised that the different components of the Vulture Stone may well have an astronomical basis. For instance, the archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte in 2010 published that this scorpion here was almost certainly a representation of Scorpius, a constellation that was certainly known to the Sumerians and obviously later Babylonians, and he published on that. And of course, the challenge therefore was, if that is Scorpius, what are the other symbols and representations of animals? What do they symbolise as well? Can we identify other celestial objects in the sky based on this knowledge? Well, there is various different ideas, and some people see the imagery of the Vulture Stone as further emphasising the importance of the Younger Dryas event. However, working with Rodney Hale, I think that we've worked out something that is far more impressive than the association with the comet impact, which I don't think is directly related to this. Because here's the main components of the Vulture Stone on the left. And if these are synchronised with the night sky of 9,600 BC, which is the date that this stone was constructed, and you place the Scorpio in exactly its position where it should be, but also imagine that the line between the stem and the head is the local horizon, and also that the figure here, the headless figure, and his head, which seems to be guarded or cupped by the vulture, is the meridian line. If you take that and synchronise it with that, it perfectly fits and shows the Cygnus constellation up here Scorpius where it should be, and this is the local horizon. In other words, Scorpius is actually below the horizon, it's actually set. And that's very significant because in Native American tradition, and I suspect in other parts of the world, Scorpius was seen as actually quite a bad sign. It was seen as an entrance into the underworld, and rituals and ceremonies could not be done until it set beneath the horizon. And once this is synchronized, you'll see that the ball not only probably represents the head of this character here, who's directly beneath it, but it also represents what's known in shamanic tradition as the hole in the sky, corresponding with the northern celestial pole, which was seen in places like Mongolia and Siberia as the point of entry and exit into the sky world, meaning that here Cygnus is guarding that entrance into the sky world. And you can see how perfectly all of this matches and synchronizes together. And once you realize that, you can also look at these other figures and start to make sense of what they represent as well. So, in my opinion, the Vulture Stone is a sky map for the soul's journey, because, let's go back to that 1 second, because I think that this figure represents either a dead person or a shaman who's in a death trance, and that the head, which is a symbol of the soul in Neolithic tradition, is entering into the sky world, symbolised here by the northern celestial pole, the turning point of the heavens. So that, in my opinion, the Vulture Stone is a sky map for the soul's journey to the afterlife via Cygnus, the Milky Way, and the northern celestial pole. And that all of the geometry, everything, is focused around there. There's that whole stone, you can see it here. Okay? And as I said, the Vulture Stone right next to it. Now, this idea of a path of souls, as it's become known, is something that seems to be extremely ancient and very universal. For instance, it's in North America, where as many as 30 to 40 different tribes have exactly the same journey of the soul. And it involves not just dead people, as I said, but the shaman as well, making a leap of faith at the point of death. And this could be a symbolic death or actual death, to the horizon at certain times of the year, where the constellation of Orion is just about to set. And that through doing this, they enter onto the Milky Way through what's known as an ogee, or a split, or a tear in the fabric of the sky itself. And once they're on the Milky Way, they then go round to where the Milky Way splits in two, forms two separate arms. And of course, we know where that is. It's exactly the position where Cygnus is. And this is the story that was told by so many different tribes and is now accepted within many academic papers and books to be the point of entry into the sky world. So once again, Cygnus seems to be like the last staging point before going out of this physical universe. In other words, the universe that we can see, basically, and going into the sky world proper, into the afterlife. And as I have been saying for many years, and my colleague and friend Graham Hancock is now saying, that these ideas were also in ancient Egypt. I mean, we all know about Orion, and we know that in death, the pharaoh becomes the god Osiris, and that the pyramid text written about 2350 BC onwards talk about the soul's journey, the pharaoh's journey as a spirit, going first to Orion, where he is greeted by the god Sah, S-A-H, as almost like a lost brother. And from this point onwards, the soul continues its journey along the Milky Way, and it goes to the womb of his cosmic mother, the cosmic mother of Osiris. Osiris is the form that every pharaoh takes in death. And so where then is the womb of the mother of Osiris, whose name is Nuit? She is the sky goddess. She's represented in the sky by the Milky Way. And the answer to that is Cygnus. That is the womb of Nuit, following the work of Professor Ronald Wells, American astronomer, wrote a series of papers on this subject. So the pharaoh, in the form of Osiris, his soul, or hers, will go back to the womb of his cosmic mother. His cosmic mother is Nuit for rebirth. That's what happens, rebirth into the afterlife. And that point of exit of this world and entry into the other world is the Cygnus constellation. It's exactly the same as you find in Native American tradition and at Gobekli Tepe. And of course, obviously I've been banging on about this in so many books in the past, and it's so good to see that others, other contemporaries and colleagues are now accepting that this was the soul's journey. Now obviously this is one of my books, Cygnus Cave, came out in 2018, and in here I set out in great detail to show that what eventually ends up at Giza via a place called Helwan, which has incredible Paleolithic settlements, came originally from the area of Gobekli Tepe and the culture that was there, the pre-pottery Neolithic culture that existed from about 9,600 BC down to about 6,000 BC. There was a direct links between the two sites, and that information tarried in the area of Giza and eventually flowered during the Pyramid Age. Obviously, in my opinion, conventionally, about 2,500, 2,600 BC. But where did this knowledge come before this? Because if this is a universal soul journey, and it's found in North America, it's found in Eurasian continent, even in North Africa, what was its point of origin? Well, the smart money at the moment, and I think this is where it's all going, is that there's a relationship between the stone enclosures at Gobekli Tepe, built 9,600 BC, and the contemporary cult structures that were being built at exactly the same time in the Ural Mountains, well to the east, on the borders between Europe and Asia. And there, for instance, an incredible thing called the Shigir idol was discovered in 1894 in a peat bog on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains. And this is what it looks like. It's been re-erected. It was originally 5.5 meters in height. And there were various other fragments of other ones found. It wasn't just on its own. There others have been found. And with one of them, fragments of a swan carving was found. And that's very important, as you'll see in a minute. But this is what the Shigir idol probably looked like. I mean, by the way, it was made of a type of wood. And it has all these faces. It's got a head on it, it has various other faces and other things along the side. Is that it's now been established by Michael Zilin, who is the main archaeologist, Russian archaeologist, that's been pushing out papers on this and showing the links with Gobekli Tepe. And its culture is that these idols originally stood within or upon stone platforms very similar to those that are found at Gobekli Tepe, in which huge great stones, like for instance that pillar 18 from enclosure D that I showed you earlier on. And there are many other links between the Urals culture and Gobekli Tepe. For instance, but we'll come on to those in a minute, but here's the thing. The people that still live in this region today still make these idols. The Khanty and the Mansi people construct these wooden poles with heads on the top of them. You can see here on the Ob River, they create these totem poles. And here's another example of them. And the interesting thing about this is that the construction of these totem poles, which are probably for protective purposes, probably also to represent ancestral spirits, maybe even the first gods, is that they are associated again and again with goose and swans. Right? According to their superstition, they worship the god of waterfowls, swans, geese, and other birds swimming on water. And that the important thing is that we might add that the goose was one of the shapes of appearance of the most popular god of the Ugarians, the world surveyor man. Now, the world surveyor man is like this turner of the heavens, a so-called cosmocrator, suggesting that the birds, particularly the swan and the goose, are associated with the turning point of the heavens. And as you'll see, almost certainly this is another reference to Cygnus and its role in the control of the heavens. But the most important and the easiest thing to prove the relationship between Gobekli Tepe and the Urals is stone tool manufacture. If you go to Gobekli Tepe, well, not so much today, but certainly when I first went there are stone tools all over the place. They date to from about 9,600 down to 8,000 BC, where basically they stopped because that's when people abandoned it and moved into other parts of the Near East and Europe. But these stone tools are of a very specific type. They are known as like a blade tool production, and they're made using something called pressure flaking and pressure retouching. Now, I'm not going to go into what that is, but it's a specialised technology that's passed on from teacher to pupil. It's not something that you could just casually find out and learn yourself. And this gentleman here, Mikael Sorensen, University of Copenhagen, says that pressure blade production emerged first in central Mongolia before being carried across the Ural Mountains westward as transmitted knowledge, in other words, passed on from teacher to pupil. Here it was finally adopted by Swiderians and post-Swiderian groups by the 10th millennia BC, the time of Gobekli Tepe. Their home was the Western Urals, with their stone tool technologies being found as far west as Poland and also as far south as the Caucasus region. And in my books, I strongly suggest that the Swiderians were involved with the building, or certainly the motivation behind the construction of Gobekli Tepe. And the proof of this, as far as I'm concerned, is that these stone tools, which are almost like a paper trail, come all the way from the Urals and end up at places like Gobekli Tepe, these beautiful ones which I'm showing here, these trifacial blades which you can see in Schönlefer Museum. I mean, these are just extraordinary, and these are part of a long tradition of blade production using pressure flaking. Now, Michael Sorensen talks about the origins of this blade tool technology coming from Mongolia, central Mongolia. Well, the place that he's got in his mind when he's writing this is a place called Tolbar, which we'll now go to. This is Mongolia. There's other sites here which we'll come to in a minute. That's Lake Baikal, immediately to the north of it. Because in the deepest layers of one of the tiny settlements here at Tolbar, which is called Tolbar 16, in central northern Mongolia, you have blade tool production occurring as early as 45,000 years ago. And this is in the bottom layers. So, in other words, it was fully formed when the earliest modern humans turn up in the region. So clearly, it's got to have come from somewhere else. But bearing in mind that this blade production is then carried, as Michael Sorensen said, gradually as waves westwards into Europe, all parts of Europe and into Southwest Asia, we need to understand where this stone tool technology is coming from. Well, the answer is, and this only came out this year, even though I put it in my book, The Cygnus Key, is that this technology is coming from a distant cousin of ourselves known as the Denisovans. By the way, that's the correct way of spelling it. Denisovans, okay? Not Denisovans, Denisovans. God, I'm getting excited. So don't worry, plenty of time for excitement. Anyway, so something was going on in this area of Tolbar 16, and that's what the archaeologists are now beginning to realise, and are actually beginning to say that this stone tool technology was given to us, handed to us by the Denisovans. So who the hell are the Denisovans? You know, we've heard this term a lot. And what is their role in the rise of civilization? Well, as I said, this is Tolbar here, which is south of Lake Baikal. But now let's go to about nearly 1,500 miles to the west of northern Mongolia, to a place called the Denisova Cave. Because exactly the same stone tool technology is going on there within a particular layer, layer 11. And layer 11 is what's known as the Denisovan layer. This is the layer which has become associated with the activities of these distant cousins of ours called the Denisovans. Here's an example of some of their work here. This is the Denisova Cave. It's in the Altai-Kral region of southern Siberia, northern part of the Altai Mountains. It goes from about 280,000 years ago through to the present day, but it's layer 11 that we're interested in. In layer 11, they found various fossil remains, human fossils or hominin remains, including this tiny, although you'll see that there's more of this later on, this tiny piece of a finger bone. Now, this was found in 2008, and in 2010, the genome was sequenced of this individual, and it was found to belong to somebody who was not a Neanderthal, not an anatomical modern human, but somebody completely different. Somebody whose genes were so different to these other two that they had to be classed as either a subspecies or a species of their own. And they soon gained the name Denisovans, the name that was given to them by those that did the sequencing, which was the Max Planck Institute of Physical Anthropology at Leipzig in Germany. And there was a higher coverage genome done 2 years later in 2002. Now, the first thing that became apparent with the sequencing of the Denisovan genome is that some of the genes that were seen within this genome we had, and we clearly inherited them from the Denisovans. Now we know where they came from. They're not from us, they came from somebody else. And some of these are beneficial to us, some of them probably not so. We'll mention a couple of them as we go along. But what it was found is that from Central Asia, eastwards into Eastern Asia, downwards into Southeast Asia, down into Ireland, Southeast Asia and Australia, and even into Oceania, there were people with anything up to 5 to 6% Denisovan DNA, but hardly any to the west of that. Why? Because people, in theory, are migrating out of Africa, they're going through Southwest Asia, and they're encountering the Denisovans, and they are interbreeding with them and then continuing their journeys to the furthest extremes of the Eurasian continent, and obviously some of them are continuing their journeys into the Americas. And that's the reason why you'll find almost all of the Denisovan DNA east of Central Asia. But what about the technology of the Denisovans? What do we know about that? What about this layer 11? And this is the most extraordinary thing found so far. It's two fragments of a so-called bracelet, although it's more like a bangle, made of a stone known as chloritolite. The greenness in it is through a mineral known as chlorite. And it's beautifully made, beautifully finished. And it was worn, probably on the arm of a woman, because it's not that big, and it has a hole penetrated through it, which would have allowed something to be hung on it, in like this, they suspect, on a cord with something else hanging, something heavy. And when the archaeologists looked at that hole under a microscope, they found that the feed rate of the drill was so fast that it was comparable to a modern day drill. Now, what this means is that not that the Denisovans had electric drills, no. What they did is have the knowledge to create a standing drill that span fast to be able to produce holes of that order. In other words, they almost had a lathe or a cutting tool or something. Also, the earliest needle in the world comes from layer 11 at the Denisova Cave. In fact, not just one, there are at least another one, possibly 2 or 3 other fragments. And what this tells us is that the Denisovans almost certainly made tailored clothing. And what we find is that these needles thereafter seem to be found in other parts, particularly of Europe, Southwest Asia, and going eastwards into China and the Russian Far East. There's a spread, a gradual spread that you can perceive. Horse DNA, horse bones found inside the Denisova Cave, have suggested to some that they may have domesticated and even ridden horses. And of course the digging continues. And in 2019 it was announced that they'd found part of a woolly mammoth ivory tiara, or I'd call it an Alice band basically, that you can see here. And almost certainly this was part of what I would see as a shaman's headband. In other words, this would be worn by a shaman and things would have been dangled from it in the manner that you can see here. And also, again, announced just within the past few months, they found red ochre, including one that they've referred to as a pencil, suggesting that it was being used to draw. Now, okay, this could have been body paint, it could have been cave art, but it may also have been used for symbols and glyphs and things like that. There's every possibility that that may have been the case. And on top of all this, the oldest confirmed musical instrument in the world has come from layer 11 of the Denisova Cave. It's fragments of either a flute or a whistle, they're not sure because it's only fragments. And this tells us that the Denisovans had a knowledge of music and how to replicate it and create notes. By the way, there is one other one that's a contender that's attributed to Neanderthals that were found in Eastern Europe, a place called Vulture, but some people say that this is natural, whatever. But it is possible that the Neanderthals also were creating musical instruments as well. And beyond that particular, those fragments of that musical instrument, others, some of the oldest flutes in the world are found in the same area. I mean, this one here is from Toba 15, which was the same site that it's Toba 16. Toba 15 in Mongolia produced this particular one. And this probably dates to about 30,000 years ago. By the way, the Siberian Denisovans disappear from the scene around 45,000 years ago. But as we'll get onto, some of the other types of Denisovans, those down in Southwest Asia, may have continued on much later. And by the way, they're made of swan bone or goose bone. I think that's very relevant. We'll come back to that. So here's the Denisova Cave here. There's Toba here in Mongolia. This is southern Siberia, obviously Russia as a whole. And these arrows represent the carrying out of this technology to other parts of the Eurasian continent between a date of roughly 45,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago. And down here they're going to the Tibetan plateau, which we'll come on to. Up here they're going into Eastern Europe, where they influence the so-called Eastern Gravatians and eventually the Proto-Solutreans of Western Europe. And obviously they're going south into Asia, South Asia, and of course into Southeast Asia as well. So it does seem as if the Denisovans had that effect. And obviously it's not just them, remember, because when they disappear, they're hybrid descendants who consist not only of anatomical modern humans mixed with Denisovans, but also Neanderthals. A first generation bone of a Neanderthal mother, Denisovan father, child was found, the bones of a child, to show that even as late as about 60,000 years ago, the Denisovans and the Neanderthals were interbreeding with each other. So you have this incredible admixture going on of three, and in fact almost certainly four different types of hominin at that time. Denisovans, Neanderthals, anatomical modern humans, and another one, species X, that's probably going to be Homo erectus, because they found a fourth type of DNA within these bones. But unfortunately we can't confirm that. But what do we know about the physiology of the Denisovans? Well, you could probably put in your hand, or certainly two hands, all of the anatomical evidence that we have of the Denisovans so far. And all of it, by one piece, which we'll come on to, was found within the Denisova Cave, not just in layer 11, but layer 22 as well, which is slightly away from layer 11. And we have 3 molars, 2 of which are of large size, 1 of which is small, obviously with the finger bone itself. And going back to the molars are so large, they are twice the size of normal humans, the chewing area. And Bence Viola, the paleoanthropologist with the University of Toronto, refers to it as a giant tooth from a rather big individual. And here you can see it next to a normal sized jaw. The other one's just as large. And in 2016, they found in the Denisova Cave, layer 11 again, 2 parts of a back of the skull. Again, that's been confirmed to be Denisovan, and it's very thick. And Svante Parbo of the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology at Leipzig in Germany says of this, they, the Denisovans, seem to have been very large and robust, even compared to Neanderthals, adding that in size and appearance, they were probably pretty impressive. Now, all of this is indicating that the Denisovans were of large size. And adding to that is the fact that almost certainly one of the direct descendants of the Denisovans is a type of distant cousin called Homo heidelbergensis. And when discovered in South Africa, Homo heidelbergensis can routinely be over 7 feet tall. And this to me suggests that the Denisovans could well have been of that height and looked very much like this individual here. I mean body-wise, not necessarily in face or in skin. This is the great Kali, who is an Indian WWE wrestler, and obviously here he is with a lady of normal size. And I think there is a good chance that some, not necessarily all, but some of the Denisovans are going to be of large size. And if that is the case, they are definitely going to be the giants of legend. I'm certain of it. In addition to what's been found in the Denisova Cave, in another cave on the edge, the northeastern edge of the Tibetan plateau, somewhere called the Bashiaya Cave, excuse me if you're Chinese, in the Zahi province in northwest China. It was found originally in 1980 by a monk. And he gave this mandible, this lower jawbone, to his lama, and he gave it to the local university where it sat until recently, until they started to realise, that these large teeth were somehow connected with the Denisovans. The protein was checked; it matched that of the other Denisovan remains coming out the Denisova Cave. So it's now confirmed to be the first mandible, the first jawbone of a Denisovan. And this is a vitally important discovery, because not only does it take us away from Siberia being, the home of the Denisovans, even though we are certain by the amount of DNA over the eastern part of the Eurasian continent, they must have been all over there as well. But here we have the first confirmed evidence that they were elsewhere, and we know that they were on the Tibetan plateau. And this is really, really interesting, because the old Tibetan documents and oral traditions say that before modern humans, their dynasties rose up, that Tibet was under the control of giants and ogres that had 2 names, Serin and Budud, however you pronounce that, Dud. And these were giants and ogres that had their own ruling dynasties. And then, our own ancestors came along, probably bashed them on the head and took over the show. And that the Tibetans are descended from them. And this is really important, because one of those genes that was inherited by us from the Denisovans, the so-called EPAS or EPAS1 gene, allows the Tibetans and the Sherpas of the Himalayas to exist and thrive at extremely high altitudes. It's about the regulation of the oxygen within the blood system, the hemoglobin, the rest of it. And this, we now know, was passed on to us by the Denisovans, which means that they must have been in that area or somewhere extremely high. Remember, the Tibetan Plateau is essentially the roof of the world for not just tens of thousands, but perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years. And that gene was then passed on to our earliest ancestors in that area, and we still have it today and still use it. But even before that jawbone was announced, again, this was the beginning of last year, thousands of blade tools were discovered at a site on the Tibetan Plateau, right? And these date to about 30,000 years ago. And this is 20,000 years before we turn up in Tibet. And it was speculated for a number of reasons that these were created either by Denisovans or by Denisovan hybrids. And these tools, by the way, match very well those found in Mongolia and Siberia. And as I said, this particular style of tool production, you don't just pick up a core and just bash and these come out. These are specialist tools. And some of them, as I said, are retouched using the so-called pressure flaking technique, which is something that is passed on only from teacher to pupil. So in other words, it was expected that the Denisovans would be found in that area, and now this has been confirmed. So we now know that the Tibetans were in Tibet, and almost certainly in legend they're remembered as these giants or ogres that existed on the plateau before we came along. Now, obviously, this is Tobar in Mongolia. This is the Denisova Cave. And I now want us to move on to another site on the west side of Lake Baikal, which is here, called Malta. Obviously, not to be confused with the place in the Mediterranean, of course. And this is an extraordinary site. It dates to 24,000 years ago, quite clearly after the Denisovans were around, probably as much as 20,000 years. But the technology and the knowledge, the craftsmanship and everything, I suspect probably is a legacy, certainly of Denisovan hybrids in the region and maybe the Denisovans themselves. And amongst the many beautiful art objects that are found are these swans, these long-necked swans with truncated wings, many of which have got holes in them that shows that they were pendants. And at least 4 or more of these, when they were discovered, they were deliberately placed and deliberately oriented. And the archaeologists working on the site came to the conclusion that this showed the earliest evidence of animism in Siberia, connected with the soul's flight as a bird, with the north-south passage of wildfowl travelling to the other world. Right, this is after Anatoly Derevianko, who's one of the main people working to this day, or not directly, but on the Denisova Cave. And these are 24,000 years old. So is it possible that this understanding of cosmological ideas and animism is something that was passed on by the Denisovans? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Cygnus is seen very much across the Eurasian continent as a swan, sometimes a goose, occasionally as an eagle or a hawk, and also obviously in the Near East area and Armenia as a vulture. But it is the swan that seems to be its main symbol. Why is it the swan? Because the swan is seen as an idealistic soul bird, and that its migrations to and from its breeding grounds in the north are seen as carrying the souls of the dead into the otherworld, a northerly placed otherworld, and then bringing them back, or bringing new souls into the world when they return back to their more southerly climes in the autumn period. I mean, you could write, chapters after chapters on this. In fact, I think I did in the Cygnus Mystery. So that's one of the reasons why swans are so important. And of course, they're impressive in their own right, and the whiteness associates with souls. And the swan is a major totem of Siberian and Mongolian shamanism, basically. And the shamans of Siberia, as we've already mentioned, they believed that there was a hole in the sky corresponding to the northern celestial pole. This is the turning point of the heavens. And of course, this is changeable based upon the 26,000 year precessional cycle. And for about 5,000 years in any one precessional cycle, this northern celestial pole crosses through the Milky Way. It doesn't do it once, twice, it does it just once. And as it passes through the Milky Way, the constellation that it corresponds to in the main is the Cygnus constellation. And it does that for about 5,000 years. So its stars then become the pole stars around which the whole of the sky turns. And this would have been incredibly impressive. The north-south alignment of the Milky Way, once every night, as it turns around like some kind of cosmic propeller around the central point, would have been just extraordinary, and something that doesn't occur since the northern celestial pole has left the Milky Way. And obviously today it's marked by the star Polaris in Ursa Minor. So it's my belief that the last two occasions when the northern celestial pole crossed the Milky Way, once about 12,000 to about 16,000 BC, and earlier about 45,000 years ago, were very, very important in the development of cosmology, particularly associated with the swan, soul birds, and obviously Cygnus as a whole. And that's one of the reasons why Cygnus is so important, and the northern opening to the dark rift, which corresponds to that exact position, is so important and has been and remains so, particularly amongst indigenous cultures in places like Siberia and Mongolia. And it's also the reason why in places like India and amongst the Hindu tradition, the Vedic tradition, you have the swan goose as the vehicle of the creator god Brahma giving out this honk that allows the universe to come into creation. And in Egypt, Geb, the earth god, who is the husband of Nuit, who we've already talked about, in the form of the goose, Gengenwer, or the great honker, honks to bring the universe into manifestation. And in this form also, he gives birth to an egg that creates the sun. All of this, I think, is a distant memory of when Cygnus marked the point of the pole star. And that these ideas probably go all the way back to 45,000 years ago when we first come into contact with the Denisovans. And to this day, the people of Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, see themselves as descended from a genetrix, a cosmic mother, in the form of a swan. And this takes the form of a story relating to a swan maiden. A swan maiden comes down with her sisters to bathe in a lake. They take off their swan shrift, as it's known, or swan coat, to bathe in the waters as a mortal woman. A hunter comes along, falls in love with one of them, and nicks her swan shrift and won't give it back, forcing her to marry him. They have children. Eventually she finds a way of getting her swan garment back, and off she goes back to Birdland. But she's left as a legacy the children, and those children become the ancestors of the tribes and clans of this area. And these ideas, unquestionably, and I show this in the Cygnus Key, go back to the Paleolithic age. This is accepted by many academics, and that they almost certainly originate in North Asia, the very area where the Denisovans are. And I'm pretty certain there is a relationship. Because I think that swan shamanism might have originated with the Denisovans, and I'll show you why. Because I want to introduce you now to something brand new. And this we'll call the mystery of the Qesem Cave. Because, I mean, this place was on my radar, but I didn't really take that much notice of it until just about a month and a half ago, this story appeared in the press. Archaic humans in Israel collected feathers 420,000 years ago. A swan wing bone found in the Qesem Cave has marks, can only be from defeathering, blah, 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 like other people that use the birds as totem for shamanic flight. And Ran Bakai It says apparently for cosmological ritual purposes, maybe they thought that with the help of the feathers they could gain the swan's characteristics. Swan shamanism. Shamanism exists in all groups too, so does rock art. All states of consciousness exist in all groups and always relate to their relationship with the world. That's the lead archaeologist talking here. So he's talking about the origins, the very point of foundation of shamanism coming out of this cave 420,000 years ago. So then you start looking into this place, this Qesem Cave. You think, what was going on there? And the more you find out about it, the more bizarre it becomes. Firstly, it's about 12 kilometers to the east of Tel Aviv. And the particular people associated with it from a date of around 420,000 years ago to about 200,000 are known as the Achileo-Hebridean Cultural Complex, okay? The AYCC as they're commonly known. And they're the people that seem to emerge out of nowhere at the very end of what's known as the Lower Paleolithic period, just before the transition into the Middle Paleolithic period. Now, exactly when that happens, we don't need to worry about at the moment. But here's some of the firsts associated with the people living in this cave. Earliest food preservation and the delayed consumption of food, earliest recycling of materials, earliest sunken fire hearth and habitual use of fire for cooking and roasting meats, earliest sharp knives to cut and serve meat, earliest division of space for specific functions, fire communal tools, a school of rock, yes, that's a title that was, I think, in the form of a teacher-pupil relationship and stone tool manufacture, earliest blade tool production on a massive repeatable scale, earliest possible shamanism and swan animism, sophisticated raw material acquisition, deep flint quarrying. Now that's just for starters. So you think, who are these people? And why have I not been onto this before? But here's the thing that just blew my mind, is because in the cave, they've also found these, what they call spheroids or polyhedrons, which are handheld objects, multifaceted in appearance. Now, it must be pointed out that the Achillean people that came before in the Lower Paleolithic also used spheres and polyhedrons, but they were crude compared with these, and almost certainly there are different reasons for the manufacture of these objects. To start off with, they were only associated with, or the main groups, clusters, were only associated with specific area of the cave. This is, by the way, this is the plan of the cave, which was the southwest area. Here's where they were found, and another group of 4. By the way, 12 were found together. I find that an interesting number, maybe coincidence. They're made of limestone, but only one was found made of flint, and that was placed separately underneath a ledge up here, and that was made of flint. And I've been in touch with the archaeologists who are excavating this cave and are producing all of the incredible papers relating to it, and they've read the articles I've already done, which can be read on Ancient Origins, and they said, I think you're on the right track for reasons which we'll come on to. And that includes the fact that there is some symbolic use of these literally Lower Paleolithic crystal balls, basically. And I think that they were used for mental focus. I don't think that that was the only reason. They may have had practical functions as well, but that something big was going on. Remember, these are the same guys that invent shamanism and connect it with the swan. So, who were the Kesem people, right, of 420,000 years ago? Well, here's a clue. Human teeth. And when I mean human, I mean anatomical modern human style teeth were found in the lowest levels, okay, dating to at least 400,000 years ago, and that later teeth found in association with this particular culture have Neanderthal traits. In other words, it seems obvious that they've interbred with Neanderthals and have actually almost become Neanderthals themselves. In other words, so much interbreeding has taken place but they start off unique, something different. And I thought about this long and hard, and I started to realise there must be a link with the Denisovans. And this was confirmed to me when I read this in paper by the main archaeologists involved. There, the Qesem individual's origin is undetermined, but we cannot exclude that Denisovans or their immediate precursors inhabited the Levant. In other words, that's them trying to carefully say there's a possibility that these could have been either early Denisovans or proto-Denisovans. And here's the thing, right, well, you say, well, hold on, you've told me that the Denisovans were really big, their teeth were really big, and yet if these teeth look like those of modern humans, what's going on here? I mean, you know, surely they are modern human. Well, firstly, it should be pointed out that the very earliest evidence that we have of anatomical modern humans dates to about 300,000 years ago and comes from Morocco. Just one example from Morocco. Earlier than this, 200,000 years ago from Ethiopia. And that's it. In theory, they should not be around any earlier. Well, here's the thing. I mentioned that finger bone earlier on that was sequenced to get the Denisovan genome. Well, there was another part of that finger bone that was sent off to another laboratory that never did their job. Or certainly something happened where they never got round to doing it. And it was in, I think, a California laboratory. And it was eventually sent to Canada and was flagged up, and pictures were eventually sent to the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and they confirmed eventually that it was the missing part of that. But here's the thing, this is it, Denisova 3, there it is, and that's the one that they had to completely pulverise to get the genome out of it, is that it doesn't look archaic. It doesn't look anything like what they thought it was going to be, which would have been similar in appearance to Neanderthals. That's what they assumed, because there's a relationship between Neanderthal ancestry and Denisovan ancestry. In fact, it's believed that the Denisovans were closer to the Neanderthals than they were modern humans. But no, it turns out that their finger bones are almost identical to modern humans or recent humans. Look, those are the two. So that brings in the possibility that the Denisovans were actually more like us than what we actually realise. And they may have looked a lot more like us and may have been closer on the family tree to us than what we ever realised. But if that's the case, what more can we establish about this? Well, thinking long and hard about this, and I did publish this in an article in Ancient Origins, and as I said, this has gone to the archaeologists out in Israel. So they've read this, and they're still talking to me. Just at the moment, I mean, but anyway, I'll come back to that in a minute. But this is basically, I think, how it goes, right? Common ancestor. We don't know who the common ancestor of all of us was. There's guesses. It possibly is Homo heidelbergensis. That splits off. Homo erectus splits off at some point. That should actually be further up there. And around 470,000 years ago, we split off from the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals go down here. And what happens is that the Denisovans split in two. They split into what we might call the northern Denisovans, the Siberian Denisovans, and the so-called southern Denisovans, or the Sunda Denisovans, after Sundaland, which is the ancient name of the continent that embraced Southeast Asia in the past. So this is what happens. Now, what I think is happening, and I'll show you a map to show how this works, is that the Siberian Denisovans encountered someone in the area of the Qesem Cave, and the two interbred, and I think that we're talking about what they call pre-dispersal modern humans. In other words, early forms of ourselves that didn't really go anywhere, and that the Siberian Denisovans themselves had this boost. They were already hybrids by the time that they left the Levant and ended up going to places like Siberia and Tibet and Mongolia and whatever. And these are the ones that, remember, go on to create all this incredible technology. Now, this is a map, which I've actually nicked from somewhere else to adopt for what I want here, but it works. Now, here's the Qesem Cave here. Here's the Denisova Cave up here, okay? Now, if we see these two different strains of Denisovans, the northern ones, the Siberian ones, came through the Levant, encountered peoples, an early form of anatomical modern humans here, and then, once they've interbred, continue on up here and become the Siberian Denisovans, whilst the southern ones, who have a more primitive form of DNA than their northern counterparts, and this is accepted, this is in the genetic papers, do not encounter the peoples of the Levant because they go via Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf, across the Indian subcontinent into Southeast Asia, and miss out on this explosion, this genesis of activity happening in the Levant. And what's interesting is that these particular Denisovans end up living much longer, and possibly continue on through till about 15,000 years ago, much later than the northern ones that die out probably about 45,000 years ago. That's what the latest evidence is saying. And I mean, I won't go through all of this here, but the Siberian Denisovans, right, they're highly sophisticated, technologically advanced, developed blade tool technology, right? Whereas the ones down south were less sophisticated technologically, did not develop blade tool technology, but stayed with flake technology. And their particular territories were all towards the south. So, is it possible, and this is what I believe, were the Siberian Denisovans hybrids of predispersal modern humans and proto-Denisovans an advantage that led not only to innovative behaviour, but also to the foundations of civilization? And as I said, I've already written this up, it's already published. So here you've got the foundations. Qesem Cave 420,000 years ago creates the Middle Paleolithic. Denisova Cave, Tolbar 45,000 years ago creates the Upper Paleolithic, our time, anatomical modern humans. And then finally, Gobekli Tepe 11.6 thousand years ago creates the Neolithic. That's the points, these are the three genesis points, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, all this ends up here, at Gobekli Tepe. All of this knowledge from 420,000 years ago. And of course here, in Egypt, 2,500 BC, 2,600, with the Pyramid Age. It all comes from it. But what was the mindset of the Denisovans? Well, okay, we talked about Malta earlier on. And one of the other artifacts that was found here was this mammoth bone plate. Remember, this is 24,000 years ago. And on one side, it's got these three snakes, it's got a hole through it, and on the other side, you have all these pecked spirals. Now, it was a Russian archaeologist by the name of Anatoly Larachev who worked out that all of these spirals, each individual one, was made up of numbers specifically associated to the movement of the celestial bodies, in particular the moon and eclipse cycles. And that these numbers were the numbers that you would associate with ancient literature, ancient time cycles, ancient king lists, the geometry of architecture found all over the Eurasian continent, but particularly in the eastern part of the country. Obvious numbers, 54, 72, 108, 216, 432, found at places like Borobudur in Java, which has got 432 Buddhas inside stupas in a representation of Mount Meru, the axis point of the physical world, the turning point of the heavens as seen from the ground. And that all of these numbers are generated through quite literally this sort of clock turning associated with these numbers a combination of eclipse cycles, particularly the 54-year triple Saros cycle, and also the 72-year precessional cycle, because as you probably know, the sun moves 1 degree against the horizon. Oh, sorry, the stars move 1 degree against the horizon every 72 years. And this seems to be something that the ancients were aware of, and the combination of this solar cycle, or stellar cycle if you want, and the lunar cycle associated with the eclipse generates these numbers, 54, 108, 216, 432, 648, which are all numbers associated with the Yuga cycles, by the way, in India, and obviously the Vedic tradition as a whole. So if this is correct, and this knowledge does come from the Denisovans, then why were they thinking this way? Well, from an early point, after the discovery of the genome, particularly after the high coverage genome sequencing in 2012, it was realised that the Denisovans had 2 key genes that were associated in modern humans when they mutated with autism. And as we know, autism can create savant abilities, many different abilities, particularly to do with artistic or musical, types, but also what we know as calendar counting. Calendar counting is the most common form of savant quality of a autistic person, or somebody on the autistic spectrum. And this involves them, their brains, if you say to them, what day of the week is the 4th of February 2054, and they'll be able to tell you Tuesday or whatever it is. But the thing is that this doesn't just work for a few years. I mean, there were some twins who could calendar count 40,000 years into the future and 40,000 years backwards. God knows how they did it backwards. We've had at least 3 calendar changes since then. I mean, they must. How the hell did they do that? But here's the thing. This is in the modern day. This is it being some kind of novelty. But the experts who have worked with autistic people and have written academic books on the subject say that in the past, this calendar counting must have had a specific function because it was still been there, and they associate it with the cycles of the sun and the moon. And I think this is very, very important. In other words, the numbers that are generated through these cycles of the sun and the moon in the eclipse cycles are being projected forward, not just a few years, but hundreds, thousands, even millions of years. Because as you know, in the Yuga cycles, we're talking about the day and night of Brahma, millions, if not billions of years that all these numbers are generated in some way. Why? And yet they all break down to 432, 108, because they are based upon the movement and the sun and the moon and the relationship between the two. And this is very typical of the mind of a savant. In other words, I think that all of these ideas were created by the Denisovans and passed on to their earliest descendants, the earliest Denisovan human and obviously Denisovan human Neanderthal hybrids. By the way, the Neanderthals don't have the same genes from what we can see. So this does specifically relate to the Denisovans. And that this is one of the reasons perhaps why they were able to develop all of these skills, like stone tools, the jewellery, clothes, music, architecture, because there's a lot of legends about the earliest the earliest giants of places like Siberia creating the earliest stone monuments, just out of interest. Now, I put all these ideas initially in the Cygnus Key, which came out in 2018, about the Savant Connection with the Denisovans, and it's repeated in the new book that's just come out with Gregory Little. But right after the publication of our book, this came out, Neanderthals' Denisovan DNA found near autism genes. Now, actually, that's wrong. It was only in the Denisovans. The Neanderthals did not have the same ones, if you read the whole article. And basically what they're saying is that there are certain genes that are common to both Denisovans and us that are specifically in an area of the brain associated with autism. And this now takes it almost beyond the possibility of this being a coincidence, and meaning that the Denisovans thought differently to us. I don't necessarily think that we can see them in terms of people on the autistic spectrum today. They just had a different mindset. They just thought and acted differently. How exactly, we don't know. Anyway, we're coming towards the end now, and just one thing left. What did the Denisovans really look like? Okay. Now, this is what the people from the Hebrew University of Israel working on the genetics of the Altai Denisovan worked out in a very complicated manner, which I really do not understand and will not even start to go into, that they figured out that through genes and gene deletions and what there and what isn't, that a Denisovan will look like that. And I think this is a very pretty picture, but I don't think that this is the way that they looked. And just recently, I've been working with an American artist to try and put everything that we've got together, genetics, any anatomical remains, anything, to try and come up with what a Denisovan look like. And we believe that this is what they look like. Okay, now this is a working process. I mean, we're still working on it now, okay? But we think this is as close as you're going to get to what a Denisovan looked like. Now, make of that as you want. And remember, I mean, this guy here may look a little bit mean, but you're living in a time where you've got saber-toothed tigers attacking you, and ice ages and comet impacts and a lot of other bad things going on in the world. So you've got to be a bit tough to survive. So, well, that's basically it. So here's the advert bit. Obviously, Denisovan Origins is the latest book written with my colleague Gregory Little. A great review that's just come out in New Dawn magazine says this thoroughly well researched and written book is, quite honestly, one of the best ancient history books I've ever had the pleasure to read. And that came out this month. Thank you. And obviously, Mr. Graham Hancock, my good friend and colleague, says a missing chapter in our knowledge of the emergence of civilization. So he's given his approval to it as well. Obviously, 2018 that came out. They had quite a lot of Denisovan stuff in it as well. Covers, by the way, by Russell Hussain, who's in the audience. Thank you, Russell, for all your hard work. Obviously, here's somewhere I can't go anymore. Why? Do you want to know why I was banned? Okay, right, and Hugh will back us up here. He was there when these words were used by Dr. Lee Clare, the site manager and the lead archaeologist. We don't want your lies and pseudoscience here. Get out. That's right, isn't it? Yeah? Yep, there you go. For those who are interested, I'm accompanying an Ancient Origins tour to Egypt in February next year, going to all the great sites from Giza down to Abu Simbel. There's a Nile cruise involved, and private tours of the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx Monument, and the Sun Temple of Nusayri. And I'm also involved with the Ancient Origins Turkey tour next year, details of which you can get on the Ancient Object, which sadly, obviously, I have to say I will not be going on. Unless I want to get arrested and thrown into a jail like something out of Midnight Express. So, anyway, if you want to keep up with what I'm up to, obviously andrewcollins.com, all the links to the social media are on there. And sometime I'll tell you about the Denisovans in ancient America. Thank you very much.